Hi, and welcome to Classical Stuff You Should Know, a podcast about classical world, classical books, old things, education, raising children up into virtue, and all that great stuff. My name is Graham Donaldson, and I am joined with my two fellow podcasters in crime. No.
Wow.
Fellow podcasters in, like hour-long mediocrity, AJ.
I think sometimes what we do could be classified as a crime.
I hope not.
Yeah.
And Thomas Fletcher Megby.
Hello. Speaking of 1 hour mediocrity, I guess that's what we're setting up for.
And Thomas, I am feeling a little listless. I'm feeling a little adrift.
Okay.
I'm feeling like I'm lacking agency and power. And I wish that I could just will myself into being a better, stronger person.
Yeah. This episode...
Powerful person.
Uh-huh. Maybe the most powerful. Maybe a kind of Ubermensch.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Where I can like glower from on high down on the little people.
You do that just fine. So this episode will not help you with any of those things, unfortunately. Also, we're not going to get into that topic for a little while. I figure we should do the announcements during this first episode that we're recording of the three. So there are a few things that are just, I find at least interesting. Maybe you don't. Some of you all might have noticed that at the end of last week's War of the Roses episode, there was a very funny audio clip at the end. Do you all remember what
Shortly,
that was?
it's gone now.
It is gone now,
Yeah.
yes. And if you're listening in the future, you'll have no idea what I'm talking about. But if you're listening to this around July 2022, you will...
Isn't technically everybody listening in the future? Like right now?
Well, the one that's really blown my mind, I was listening. So you all saw those beautiful pictures of the Hubble telescope, right? And but what you're seeing with the Hubble telescope is
like 10,000 years ago.
Is the past, because light takes time to travel. Every time you see something, you're seeing the past because light takes time to reach your eyes. So all vision is time travel, is what I'm trying to say.
I'm never in the present. I can never be present.
You can never be present.
Oh man,
No,
take that, Oprah.
Okay,
you can never see the present. You can never be anywhere except the present.
Man, this is
So you can never see your own reality. That's the
So
truth.
we're perpetually disconnected.
Yeah,
Wow.
always.
okay. Man, we're turning into one of those like psilocybin podcasts.
We have always been one of those podcasts. Anyway, speaking of psilocybin, at the end of last week's War of the Roses episode, there was an extra 2 minutes of audio, which I thought was very, very funny. So if you listened to it, you heard it was only my microphone recording the last 2 minutes of AJ's second social contract episode. So you might have found it funny. It was obviously my favorite piece of audio ever because my audio was twice as loud as AJ and Graham's.
Which has never happened.
I think it's never happened. So I think it's the one time our audio mix has been correct. So AJ, I want to thank you for those last 2 minutes of the social contract episode.
No problem.
No
What I
problem.
can.
Much
Helping out the
appreciated.
people.
We have decided to cut the pay of our quality control manager by 50%, and we apologize for the mistake.
Aren't you the quality control manager?
I'm the one who catches your mistakes. I was making
So
a joke
that's-
about you. I'm not.
So that's you. You're the quality control.
I only see it after it's uploaded. You uploaded anyway. Whatever. It doesn't matter. Okay. So speaking of the second episode on the social contract, do you remember what you titled this episode, AJ? Social Contract 2.
Electric Boogaloo.
Now, this is of course a reference to what's the movie?
I don't know. I'm actually referencing a TV show that's referencing.
Oh,
the
never
movie.
Is it Boogie Nights?
Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo. So you're pretty close.
Oh, is it really?
That's the name of the movie. I can now confirm this is your favorite movie. Do you want to know how I know this is your favorite movie?
How do you know?
This is the second time you have titled an episode
It's true.
with Electric Boogaloo.
It
Again,
is.
it's one of my favorite things to do.
Well, you've only done...
Blank, blank, 2, Electric Boogaloo.
So this, I think, further confirms it as your favorite movie then. The other episode was 120, Climbing Parnassus 2, Electric Boogaloo. So this is only the second time you've done it. I do believe that makes the Social Contract 2 the Electric Boogaloo of Electric Boogaloos, because it was the second time you've done it.
Yeah.
Can you add another Electric Boogaloo to the end of that title?
You want me
Squared?
to Boogaloo this one twice?
Or just
Not this one. This is part 3. So
Boogaloogaloo?
no, I have a very profound and refined title for this one. I don't want Electric Boogaloo sullying that title. This would be the worst.
Okay, you got to send it to me because otherwise I'm just going to title it whatever I think of at like 11 p.m.
Later than that, we had some troubles last. I feel bad for you.
Yeah.
I know I'm giving
you
you
feel bad. You just cut his pay 50%.
Zero
He
to
cut his own
zero.
pay 50%.
Thanks. I don't get to listen to them before they go up. Finally, and perhaps most surprisingly, Graham and I read a book. Do you remember this? We read a book and we both liked a book. Is this ringing a bell?
Oh, I may not have finished it. Is it?
Don't say that.
Wait, which?
You
I don't know
blurbed
which
it. So the book
we're
that we
talking
both read is Reforming Classical
about.
Education.
Oh no, I haven't read that book. Oh wait, maybe I have.
The one that you
Sorry, it was the book I wasn't thinking of.
Oh, okay. So Graham and I recently read a book titled Reforming Classical Education, and it's published by the Davenant Institute.
Oh, yes.
A self-described group of friends eager to see a renewal of scholarship and intellectual life in contemporary Protestantism at the institutional level, rather. Graham, what do you remember from reading this book?
Well, it's a collection of essays.
It is.
And it's a collection of essays. So oftentimes, a lot of classical education is ecumenical in its nature, and a lot of it. So there's a lot of Catholic sort of traditions and Orthodox traditions and Protestant traditions. And this one specifically looking at classical education through sort of talking through the Protestant tradition. So that's the biggest takeaway. So if you are a Protestant and interested in classical education, when this book comes out, it's a good read. What was your favorite essay?
Oh, my favorite one, there's an essay on Plato called Uncorrupting the Youth, A Platonic Education by Colin Redimer, I believe is his name. And it was questioning whether we should or how should Plato be taught to high schoolers particularly. That's what most of these are oriented to. So I think many of the authors either have PhD level studies or such as Colin Redimer is, I think, in his PhD right now. But it's very good. Graham said this already, but if you are involved in classical education, I would say even beyond Protestantism, it very much is, it's toward a view of Protestant classical education. But I think for anyone involved in classical education, it is a profitable book. It's one you won't agree with everything, but that's kind of the point of a book. I thought this was a fun quote from that essay on Plato. I'll just go ahead and read it. If it's my episode, I guess I can do whatever I want.
Do what you want.
Get after it.
This is from Colin Redimer's essay. As someone who has spent time in the classical Christian education world, I have to conclude that we cannot use Plato as a model for our educational institutions. At present, lip service is paid to him in our Socratic discussions, and by keeping him in the curriculum in a minimal way, a sprinkling of apology here, a dash from the Republic there, the fairy dust of culture. We do not take him seriously enough to engage him robustly, nor do we fear him. He exists as an aged uncle invited to dinner out of an abundance of piety. He shows up and sups and speaks, and we nod as we studiously ignore him and return to our meal. But such uncles must be watched, as they are not universally benign. Contemporary educators who assign Plato for homework are leaving their charges in a vulnerable position. They should not. Anyway, it is...
Because Plato's a crazy person.
Sure. It's on
Remember
corrupting.
your episode on Republic, AJ? With don't teach math till you're 30 and...
No, math until you're 30.
And then philosophy.
oh, that's right. And
after
then
30.
lie to them, telling them that they have magic blood.
Yes.
Golden blood, yes.
I mean, maybe they do.
And there's a weird, lottery for...
Oh, yeah. For hooking
making
up,
kids
For having families.
That's why you can't ever marry somebody your own age, because they might be your sister.
Yeah.
This is unfortunate. Anyway, it's very good. There are lots of... Obviously, that's only one essay. I think there are 9 or 10 in there. But it's very good. You should check it out. If you are interested, you can find it at davenantinstitute.org. Davenant is D-A-V-E-N-A-N-T, institute.org. Hope that I have spelled that correctly. Because he's the one who connected us, big thank you to Dr. Mark Hamilton for giving us the privilege of getting to read and then blurb the book as well. I think that Dr. Hamilton and his family listen to this podcast, so obviously they have...
apologies.
Well, yes, apologies for this episode and all of mine, but also I commend you on your excellent taste in premium audio content, so thank you.
I thought you were talking about the First Things lecture.
Oh, Carl Trueman is coming to Austin.
I have yet to finish his book, which is what I was thinking of earlier.
Oh, no. I don't know if... Are you coming back to that book at some point?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah.
Okay.
It's great. I mean... having finished it / slowly enjoying it pick whichever one you want to use to describe it.
Sure. But yeah, I think Dr. Trueman, I think he must have a PhD. He teaches at the university level. Anyway, Carl Trueman is coming to Austin in September, I think. So looking forward to that. All right. I'm going into this as our third part on a series on Leopardi and Nietzsche. I'll start off with some clarifications from the previous episode, since I think that clarification sounds better than me saying stuff we got wrong. We said last episode that Nietzsche was charting a genealogy of morality to show how dumb people were for believing in good versus bad or good versus evil. This is explicitly not Nietzsche's goal. This is one I had to go back and look for, because I think listening to the argument that good things come from nobility and bad things come from commoners makes us think that Nietzsche's saying you're stupid for believing these things, or even that he's in favor of the good nobles and opposed to the bad commoners. What Nietzsche will say is that he's not attempting to take either side. What he's trying to do, and he might fail at this, that's fine, is he's trying to point out that even in interpreting it that way, we have certain positive associations with things that are noble and certain negative associations with things that are common or basic or base. And that association isn't necessarily an objectively true thing. He's trying to trace through language and say, we have these connotations, so associations with certain words, and he's questioning why do we have these connotations? And the way that he gets there is through these two different words we talked about last time.
His language argument, right?
His language argument. And going into the details is probably not profitable. I shouldn't have done it last time. But the easiest way to summarize it is the similarity between these two words in German, because that's the language he's writing in. Schlicht, which means plain, and schlecht, which means bad. So that one letter difference, the question he's raising is there any meaning to that similarity? And you can take the stance to say these languages develop randomly, that there's no meaning encompassed in that similarity. Nietzsche, through his academic training in this not obscure, but now obscure, at one time not obscure field, philology, would say, no, there's some similarity here that we can read some amount of meaning into. He's not trying to attach meaning to that history that says good has come from nobility and bad has come from commoners. He's trying to merely say this is the genealogy. He's attempting to make an objective historical claim in the same way that telling stories about the War of the Roses is not, we're not doing something negative. We're just trying to tell the story objectively as it happened. Mm-hmm. That's what he thinks he's doing. And you can agree or disagree with him, but that's the project that he views himself as accomplishing.
It's weird to have Nietzsche not taking a stance on something. He was a pretty stance-heavy guy.
I think something that I have trouble with is that I don't think I read stances into what he's saying, and I'm not sure that he holds the stances I give to him. That I think I want to find more coherence in Nietzsche's writing than is actually in Nietzsche's writing. And that sounds like the backhanded compliment that it is, because Nietzsche himself says he's not aiming for coherence, but I want coherence. And that's what you're saying. So he comes across as sounding very certain on a lot of things when really he's just saying this is a true thing and then moving on to his next
But it might
thing.
not be coherent.
Exactly. Because even in this, he views himself kind of as tearing down tradition. That's my way of applying coherence to this. But the things he chooses to attack, there's no rhyme or reason to it other than he attacks religion. But other than that, he's just finding things and pulling at them. When we'll get to the end of kind of what this is all leading to. In the same vein, and probably to finally connect some dots between Leopardi and Nietzsche, we've referenced our sad, sad friend Leopardi, and I don't know if we've really given a stance on Nietzsche as to whether he is a optimist or pessimist. I referenced this last time. I'll read a quote to back this up. But the philosophical school of pessimism that we're dealing with here is best embodied, most famously embodied, by Arthur Schopenhauer. He predated Nietzsche, and his writings were very influential to Nietzsche. And I'll read this quote to kind of give a view of what pessimism is. Pessimism, the philosophical school, is not that people should be sad. It's a view toward how do we deal with the problem of evil primarily, or what is the nature of being. It's a philosophical position more than an attitude one has. I'll read the quote. This is from Schopenhauer. That thousands have lived in happiness and joy would never do away with the anguish and death agony of one individual, and just as little does my present well-being undo my previous sufferings. Therefore, were the evil in the world even 100 times less than it is, its mere existence would still be sufficient to establish a truth that may be expressed in various ways, although always only somewhat indirectly, namely, that we have not to be pleased but rather sorry about the existence of the world, that its non-existence would be preferable to its existence, that it is something which at bottom ought not to be, and so on. So
Bummer.
Yeah.
I literally wrote "so bummer." So can
want to click my heels together after that one.
to go back home to somewhere
Oh,
other than
just
here?
like enjoy, you know,
Oh,
like
get over it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, can you summarize that quote for me? What is Schopenhauer's argument?
I mean, it's take all of the joy in the world and put it into, it's almost not utilitarian, but well, it sort of is kind of a utilitarian argument, but he's saying that the drawdowns of sadness in the world are, exponentially worse than all of the combined joy of the world, and therefore it would be a net positive if the game didn't happen.
Sure. Anything else, AJ?
Well, that's about it. Any evil makes everything terrible.
Sure. And even to pull on that utilitarianism point, utilitarianism has this concept that there's happiness, which can make something more right, and there is unhappiness that can make something less right, and those kind of balance out. Mm-hmm. Schopenhauer's argument goes even further to say these aren't the same thing.
It's almost like a logarithmic. Like the bad is exponentially worse than, you need like, you're never even going to get enough happiness to counterbalance the bad.
Sure. I'm trying to remember.
So he's a glass half empty.
And
full
the
of-
glass shouldn't exist.
Glass half empty, and therefore it's full of poison, and we should curse the world.
Well, all I'm trying to do is separate the philosophical position from the attitude, because there's a way of being a bummer in the world that isn't taught. What Schopenhauer is trying to do is describe reality.
You can be there's a happy pessimism, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and I think Nietzsche reaches that point.
Maybe.
And that's and you can disagree with that, and we'll have no time to do that at the end of this episode. But I think that Leopardi is just purely in the line of Schopenhauer to say, again, he looks at a garden, and yes, there are beautiful things in the garden, but what's the garden also doing?
the bees are killing the bugs,
Yes.
and
And they're decaying.
And they're
ultimately.
decaying.
So to look at anything is to see death,
Yeah.
and to see the end of things, as opposed to normal people who see pretty flowers and bees and insects. That's not what Leopardi
mean the
sees.
normies?
Normies, yeah. But this is my point of we can say that we don't like certain opinions. My question is, how do we respond to this and say he's wrong? And we'll get there. Probably
As opposed
not.
to just making fun of them.
Yes, because we can make fun of Leopardi, and
Sure.
and we can laugh at the Schopenhauer quote because it sounds very silly.
But
the question
we-
is, what is right?
Yeah.
Because Schopenhauer, as all philosophers do, are trying to reach at truth. And this is him describing what he sees as true, that happiness and sadness don't cancel each other out. They are fundamentally different things. How does one respond to that? Just before we'll get there, and by we'll get there, I mean we'll never get there. Schopenhauer is he's so fixated, just to repeat it, he's fixated on the presence of this amorphous thing called suffering. The amount doesn't even matter. It's that suffering exists, that he can't be happy. Even when he must have had good meals, he must have had good conversations, but those didn't balance out that 100 miles away, someone was having a bad day, to oversimplify the negative of
Really,
it.
he even goes that far? Does he go as far as to say, like, someone could have the happiest life and experience no suffering, but if somebody else 100 miles away experienced suffering, that person's life wasn't happy? Or still the whole game should be canceled out?
Obviously, I don't want to overstate my
Sure.
study into Schopenhauer. I'll just repeat again. Therefore, were the evil in the world even 100 times
Yeah,
less
yeah.
than it is, its mere existence would still be sufficient. So, that there is any suffering in the world means there is an evil or a badness inherent to existence.
Yeah.
That those two go together.
And because happiness can't balance it out because they're fundamentally different things, the fact that it exists makes
Is all there
existence
is.
terrible.
Exactly. Yes. It's almost poisoned by the existence of suffering, to take what you're saying. So that's his view. I know you two don't agree with it, but that's the view that he's putting forth. So
I knew a guy in college like that.
Well, it makes me think of. I'm sorry, I don't want to derail us. If you want to move on,
You go for it.
well, it just makes me think of that section in The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis where what is it? There's a woman who's like, why can't I am miserable, and that should make you miserable.
It's about her kid, right?
Yeah, it's about her kid, and he's like, I can't be miserable here, and basically all of hell is contained within a crack in the ground because hell doesn't get to veto heaven.
Right.
Right? Like they don't have the right, evil does not have the right to say that therefore no good shall exist.
Sure.
And even all of that evil can't undo the smallest bit of good in heaven. It just makes me think of that. I don't know that that's a good philosophical rebuttal to Schopenhauer.
Yeah.
Saying that good and evil are two fundamentally different things. I'd have to understand better where he is he is getting that because they seem to be in the same family.
But it's funny because they're just the opposite of each other.
Yeah,
Lewis
yes.
says that it's the goodness isn't outweighed by the bad. Schopenhauer will say the bad isn't outdone by the good. And due to my lack of research, not the lack of thought on their parts, these are unfounded statements, right? I forget what our bell is for. Is it?
a blind assertion.
Blind assertion. Can you ring?
Well, it's not for you though.
No, it's for these two.
Okay, yeah.
Just two. Thank you.
There
So
you
these
go.
are blind assertions from both of them, only because I haven't done the research. Apologies. I also think because I want to be quippy with Schopenhauer because I'm in the same boat of not agreeing with him, but I want to treat him seriously. But it does make me think of that H.L. Mencken quote about Puritans that I'm sure you've heard before. But it's almost the inverse of that Puritan quote. It's that Schopenhauer has this haunting fear that someone somewhere may be unhappy. The Puritan one is that haunting fear that someone might be happy. So again, there's no possibility of his own personal happiness because of this general sense of the possibility of suffering around him. I won't belabor the connection to Leopardi because I think you could hear Leopardi making that exact same quote that I just read from Schopenhauer, that he's just distinctly in this line of pessimism that follows from Schopenhauer, then ultimately to Nietzsche.
Just a weird question. Did Schopenhauer ever get a girlfriend?
Schopenhauer lived a long life. I don't know if he was married. Again, these are things I should know. I only have like one quote of his and very little else. But he lived a long life, and if you see, there's a famous statue of him walking with a dog, and he looks very jaunty and like happy. So this is again why I want to separate philosophy versus affect. I think those are different things.
Sure. I was just wondering if he and Leopardi would have hung out while they didn't get invited to parties.
Well, no one would hang out. No one would hang out with Leopardi. He has a smelly hunchback, unfortunately.
Right. So I was wondering if Schopenhauer
was not. He has great mutton chops. If you ever see him, he's like incredible facial hair. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Yeah. So that's him. So that is Schopenhauer. To move slightly away just for a second, I think before even addressing any philosophical concerns, as a practical matter, I think Schopenhauer's position is a quick and easy way to paralysis. Why do anything? Why seek any happiness if the world is still fundamentally evil to its core? I think there are interesting books. They're popular. They're somewhat recent. Some are not that recent. But I think of titles like The Next Right Thing or Eugene Peterson, Along Obedience in the Same Direction, as correctives to this obsession with the presence of some kind of badness outside of oneself. We're not responsible for those things, and so we kind of have to do right with what we have and then let the rest take care of itself in some way. Are you all familiar with either of these books, The Next Right Thing or A Long Obedience in the Same Direction?
I haven't read them. I just know the concepts.
Yeah, heard of them.
And do you have thoughts on the concepts themselves? Are they helpful ideas?
I mean, they're helpful ideas. I guess the argument, so essentially they're saying, like, you can't change the presence of evil in the world, so focus on doing the next right thing or focus on Eugene Peterson, like, being faithful. Mm-hmm. And so, basically take everything and make it a lot smaller, turn down the volume on everything, and just focus on what you can achieve in front of you.
Yes.
Which is, I think, fine psychological advice, but it doesn't answer Schopenhauer's question. Like it is a coping mechanism. It is not a grappling with Schopenhauer's point, I think.
I think that's a fair point.
Man, I wish I knew more about Schopenhauer's point because
I feel bad for bringing it up.
That's okay. It still seems to me like he's making a value judgment because you could say on the other side, these two things are fundamentally not opposite.
Yes.
And therefore, any presence of good in the world should mean that we preserve it.
Yes. Isn't this always our criticism of philosophy, that there's always an underlying value judgment made that can't be backed up? This, I think, is very tied to your episode on math. What was the name of that one?
Yeah. No. That was on math.
Okay, great. That no mathematical system can prove itself.
Yeah.
I think that's true of these philosophies also. All these philosophies require some kind of value judgment outside of them to then say these things in the philosophy are right or wrong. Again, let's table the Schopenhauer himself, because I haven't. Again, I'm just bringing up his quote to kind of present a genealogy that goes from Schopenhauer to Leopardi to Nietzsche.
Okay, so we really derailed you.
Oh, so, well, kind of.
Okay.
I mean, the answer is yes, right? But so I agree that these are things that are sidestepping the issue as opposed to dealing with them. I think, again, just purely as a practical matter, that they're very helpful. Just as fun trivia, do you know where these titles come from? The Next Right Thing or A Long Obedience in the Same Direction?
No, I don't. I just know there was attributed to. I know The Long Obedience. I thought it was a
Lewis Carroll.
It was a Eugene Peterson essay.
It might have started that way, and it's a book now.
Yeah,
because
it's probably
I
a
think-
song
I
lyric.
think I own that book. So song lyric rounds to poem for the Emily Freeman Next Right Thing. It comes from a poem that Elizabeth Elliot would like to quote or quoted regularly, and that's where Freeman heard that. A long obedience in the same direction comes from this little section I'm going to read you right now. The essential thing in heaven and upon earth seems, to say it again, to be a protracted obedience in one direction. From out of that, there always emerges, and has always emerged in the long run, something for the sake of which it is worthwhile to live on earth. For example, virtue, art, music, dance, reason, spirituality, something transfiguring, refined, mad, and divine. Do you want to guess? Who said that quote?
Thomas Merton.
Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, gosh.
Friedrich Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil. So, let's just...
Awesome.
Well, just to trace this again. Schopenhauer, everything is bad. Just suck it up. Leopardi, everything is bad. I want to die. Nietzsche, long obedience in the same direction. I know you don't like
That's
this.
overstating it.
Of course it is.
Go ahead.
But he's not aiming for coherence. Greg.
Well, that part's true. I'm overstating it. Well, I want you to tell me why I'm overstating it. But the one thing I don't think I'm overstating is that he doesn't follow directly in the line from Schopenhauer. That's the only point I'm making.
I guess it's the big question is obedience to what or to whom?
That is a great point. Nietzsche will ultimately say oneself, that I am the one who gets to pick right and wrong. I must live true to myself.
And Eugene Peterson is definitely not
course
saying
not.
that.
How
No.
can you do anything except obey yourself?
Because there are certain ways that we are programmed by society around us, our families. We must throw those things off. That's the whole will to power. That's the whole genealogy of morals, and put on values that we choose ourselves. But ultimately also sidestepping the issue of how do I know what I am? But I don't want to go into that at all.
Oh, yeah. There's other,
So we're back to our psilocybin podcast.
Yeah.
We've always been there. And just, I think it's reasonable to raise questions of why we're doing 3 episodes on 2 people who are kind of bummers. And I think maybe you don't. I don't think.
We live in a Nietzsche world, my friend.
I think that's a fine reason for it also. But then why go into the level, why did I waste my time reading the Genealogy of Morals is what I'm really trying to get at. And I think some piece of it is that just because you disagree with the outcomes or disagree with,
The expression of it.
well, there's this thing called nihilism, which Nietzsche is not presenting. Nietzsche is presenting Nietzsche's thoughts on the world. And Nietzsche is trying to say, these are true things and these are false things. But there's no nihilism. Does that make sense? Nihilism is the meme we give to this collection of people who we've never read and say, that's nihilism.
Yeah.
When in fact, all there is Nietzsche. There is no nihilism. And I think that there are useful things to get from Nietzsche that are worthwhile. It's not all good, and you have to have some discernment to tell the good from the bad. But it's interesting. Eugene Peterson found things that were helpful from it. I think others might as well.
The essay, The Madman, one where we've killed God.
Yeah.
That's a great essay.
Oh, I loved reading Nietzsche. I read Thus Spake Zarathustra, or at least most of it, and it's a hoot.
Because it's an enjoyable read. Do you find his arguments compelling?
It's an enjoyable read, and many of his arguments. So I think I've said this before, but as a Christian, I think it's important to read people who are critical of Christianity, and he keyed in on a few things that Christians do that maybe we shouldn't.
Yes.
And that was very influential for me, seeing like, okay, here's a thing that we do in Christian culture that shouldn't be done,
Right.
and is harmful to society and harmful to everybody, and isn't really included in the Gospels and Christ's message at all. It's just something we do. And so that was really influential. And then there are parts where I'm like, he's so way off, I'm not even in danger of falling into this trap. Like when I remember one particular argument where he said a philosophy of diffused love is one of strength, and a philosophy of particular love is one of weakness. And I think we've talked about this before.
You have, yes.
Yeah. But if you've ever loved someone individually, you know that's way harder than loving everyone
Loving
kind
love,
of vaguely.
the idea of love.
And it's similar to our Marx, our
Yes.
podcast on Marx, where it was like the diagnosis of the problem is really compelling, and then the solution is super debatable. It's similar to Nietzsche, where it's like 90% of what he says, you're like, yep, I'm on board. I follow. It makes total sense. Wait, what?
Right.
I need to be a what?
Sure.
I need to do this, and then you're sort of off into and those are the kinds of things that I find very compelling or very interesting to read. Are those like 90-10 writers where
Yeah.
90% you're on board, and then that last 10% is a big left-hand turn where
Right.
you're wondering.
And
where do we lose sync here?
And I appreciate that he's following something to its final conclusion.
Yes.
Right. He's living in a time when he could see the demise of religion and say, like, this is coming and we're going to have to figure out what to do in its absence. And
Right.
so he hopped into the boat and then flew down the rushing river when no one else was willing to.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who now will tell you they don't believe in God, but they still maintain a morality.
They still
if they
functionally
did.
do.
And the question is, how and
Right.
why? And Nietzsche would say, like, you're insane.
Right.
It is insane to follow a morality from a religion you don't believe in.
Right.
And I appreciated his honesty and his bravery in that sense.
And I think this is in line with what you're saying, maybe not the exact same, is that so Nietzsche spends a lot of time criticizing Christianity. His criticisms are pretty good because he's a smart guy. He's a smart, thoughtful, well-read guy. So if he's raising concerns and you don't have an answer to what he's saying, that's probably
problem.
something to study.
Yeah.
Now, thankfully, Christianity has a 2,000-year history in which essentially every question ever has been brought up before and defended by someone much holier than me. And so normally the answer is to go look for that, or having the Bible to go to is great also. But just to say that if you're hearing a criticism that you haven't considered before, it doesn't have to be an attack. It can be kind of like a what's the shot?
Vaccine.
It's like a vaccine where like you introduce some kind of foreign agent into your body learns to protect against it, and then you move on healthier. I think it's, even if you hate everything Nietzsche stands for, I think that is a fine way to read and absorb Nietzsche.
Cool. I think that's how any philosophy should deal with attacks.
Yes.
If you really believe that your thing is true,
Yes.
then it will hold up to attacks. And so an attack should be something you go and investigate, not something you shy from.
True.
And I try to do that with Christianity, but I think something all Christians should do, right? An attack doesn't necessarily mean that you let the whole thing come crumbling down.
Right.
And if it does mean that the whole thing comes crumbling down, then maybe you are believing the wrong thing.
Yeah, that what you were calling Christianity is not, again, if for Christianity to have lasted 2,000 years, it stood up to much worse than whatever crisis you're dealing with right now. Right?
Exactly.
And I'm saying this more from kind of the intellectual side of having an intellectual doubt that has probably been answered at some point. But yeah, I think that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Can I introduce maybe one of those attacks that
Sure.
he will attempt, and I think it's an interesting one. So there is a term, universal morality, or moral relativism as opposed to moral universalism or absolutism, maybe as another word for it. Are these are words that you have heard before?
Yes.
I think I'm a moral universalist.
Okay. Well, give me. Can we define our terms when we say moral relativism? That normally means
Your morals are defined by your circumstances and your current values and essentially your society.
And the culture that you come from.
The culture. So everything around you is, your morals are relative to what's going on in your circumstance.
So a 10th grader will say things like, well, we only believe that murder is wrong because we've been taught it, whereas there's probably a tribe in Africa that believes that murder is okay.
sure.
Or
And it's not exactly a compelling.
Not a compelling argument.
Or what I see very, very often is when we talk about the system of sin that Dante has set up, he'd be like, well, they believed in sins differently back then. And I was like, well, sins haven't changed though. Right? So he's trying to say something about sins,
But that's interesting.
either it's relevant or it's not.
Like usury.
I don't want to follow. I do want to follow this one. Is there not something to his ordering that is related to his background? So his time and the way that he places the importance on loyalty.
Okay, so and this is why I call myself a moral universalist, is because I sort of take C.S. Lewis's
Wait,
stance.
Thomas, can you finish that point for people that maybe aren't totally on understanding where you're going with in terms of Dante's background?
Oh,
He placed loyalty at the bottom
very
because...
bottom. Well, he wasn't kicked out of his
Yeah.
town because he was allied with, I forget which group of Ghibellines or
Yeah,
whatever.
I just wanted to say, just because he was involved in
sorry.
all that political intrigue,
Yes, and-
personally, maybe he puts loyalty at the bottom because of his own personal context.
and maybe lived at a
Lived at a time
Lived at a
where
time when
loyalty was
usury
at a
was a big
premium.
deal.
Yeah, yeah.
And-
but also to say that he lived in a time pre-Italian state, so that loyalty to your kind of local group of people meant much more. Like you lived or died based on that loyalty, as opposed to now where you can be unpatriotic and still live in the United States.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yes.
So
Yeah,
I just wanted you to
so,
thank you.
so
thank you.
moral universalism makes this claim, and this is a claim that I stand by, is that there are a certain set of values that are premises, not conclusions. They're essentially not to be challenged and have found the same expression in all humanity throughout all time. Not the same expression, but have existed in humanity. The expression does change.
Can I maybe focus that a little bit?
Sure.
So the expression changes, but if you were to take those expressions and work backwards, you would get to that premise that is unchanged throughout humanity.
Yeah. So, for example, like tolerance is one of the primary virtues, I would say, of the United States right now. It is an outcropping of what we would call charity or love, right? An essential virtue. Now, the expression does change relative to circumstance, right? So I'm thinking honor for Rome. I'm thinking intellectual curiosity for the Greeks. And there are these things that find more or less expression, and there can be real advancements, right? Tolerance is not as much a virtue as kindness, but they reach down to those same set things. A society where true cowardice, I mean, real cowardice was celebrated is one that we cannot imagine. Or for example, loyalty, right? Where betraying my very best friend for no reason at all is something that is taught and lauded in schools, right? It's so alien to us that we cannot conceive of it. That's moral universalism, at least as far as I.
Yeah, and you may find an example where someone has betrayed their best friend, but it's that no reason at all that's important, because they may have betrayed their best friend because they were in service to a different ideal that they held as being more important than that particular loyalty.
Or because they were being a coward, in which case you are still upholding, like bravery as a virtue and also betrayal as a negative, right? We can barely imagine a society where the virtues are truly backwards.
Okay. Well, let's try.
Nor do we have an example of one in history.
We don't have one. Yeah.
So then you all, this will be good. So with that set up, I have 3 questions here. So do you all both subscribe to some form of moral absolutism or universal?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I do.
Universal morality. Okay. So since you both subscribe to this, I'm expecting both of you to have all the exact same answers, because that's the meaning of moral absolutism.
I mean, I already I know the trick you're doing, but okay.
I'm very excited.
Rock and roll, buddy.
Now, I've picked these 3 questions randomly, and I don't expect you all to disagree on any of them. Are you prepared
Because
for
we're
these questions?
moral absolutists.
Right, exactly. Are you prepared?
Yes, I'm prepared.
You wake up next to a set of trolley tracks. In
my
the distance,
word.
you see in the distance, you see a trolley headed for 5 people who are tied to the tracks. You see a lever next to you, which, if pulled, will redirect the trolley to a section of tracks with one person tied to it. Do you pull the lever?
I throw Thomas in front of the trolley.
Look, as moral absolutist, I know that you two will have the same answer to this.
I already want to argue with you.
I know. Question number 2. If you wanted to argue,
I'm
with
writing
me,
it down.
I only need a yes or no. For number 2,
Well, there's a yes or do you pull the lever?
do you pull the lever? That's
okay.
Number 2, which I also expect you to have no disagreement about, is T.S. Eliot an overrated poet? And finally, number 3. This one's a little longer, so please feel free to take time. I will be talking while you answer this. No, please don't corroborate on this. Number 3, when someone is convicted of a crime, should they be punished, and why? When someone is convicted of a crime, should they be punished, and why? While Graham finished much more quickly than I expected him to, I will briefly talk through the genealogy of morality and give a brief overview of the second and third essays. All I managed to butcher in the first one was the first essay, and here I'll do violence to the second and third parts. So again, book 1 is focused on these 2 dichotomies of good and bad and good and evil. Where did they come from? Good and bad, he ties to nobility versus not nobility. In good and evil, he ties to he ties to the religious realm, and says that historically questions of good and evil have been answered in the religious sector. He'll tie it because he doesn't believe in God. He'll say that most religious commands come from purity first and foremost. And if you read the Old Testament, you could see that condemning shellfish is because, shellfish can have bad diseases in them, therefore you shouldn't eat them. Things like that. It's obviously an irreligious reading of the Old Testament, but it's not an illogical reading of it, just to say that. Okay. And then in this second part, he has lots of examples. One of them is on violence and why on punishment. Why are criminals punished? So before we go into that, let's take our 3 answers. So the first one, for the trolley. Do you pull on the count of 3? I'll say 1, 2, 3, and then you both say your answers. They'll both ring out in unison together. You can pull a lever and redirect a trolley from 5 people to 1. Do you pull the lever 1, 2, 3?
No.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly.
Can I pull a lever over and over and over again until I break it?
Sure.
And then hopefully it gets broken halfway in between and the trolley just careens off the tracks?
No. Number 2, is T.S. Eliot an overrated poet? 1, 2, 3.
Yes.
No. Okay, great. And then before we go on to the third one,
Well, sorry.
How does that have to do with objective
Can I
morality?
say,
are aesthetic choices subjective?
and can I say T.S. Eliot's not an overrated poet, but that specific poem is?
The Wasteland, you
Yeah.
mean? Yeah, okay. That's a fine position to hold.
Okay.
Are our perceptions of art relative? Does this not
Well,
fall?
your question is about like overrated in terms of public opinion.
Sure.
I mean, everyone could think it's terrible, but that doesn't mean it's
Should I have
bad.
asked, is it good?
Yes.
Is T.S. Eliot a good poet?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Is The Wasteland good?
Yes.
No.
Well, there you go. Okay. I should have asked, is The Wasteland good? I apologize. So why do you two have different answers to these first two? Just take the first one. The first one is about murder or not murder. Oh, maybe not. You think you would be murdering that one person by pulling the lever, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's about murder.
I think
which
I'd
is
be
a-
murdering the 5 by
by not playing it.
By not.
So-
I walk around not doing things all the time and people die.
Okay, I don't want to go into it. We
You
did a whole episode on it.
savage.
Yeah, nice try. If moral absolutism is true, if there are absolute moral values, why do you two disagree on a very simple yes/no question?
Because, and I said this, the expression of morals can change, but both of us are reaching down to a universal moral, and the universal moral is that life is worth preserving and murder is wrong. Right?
Yes.
We are both trying to not commit murder or have the least murder committed possible.
Mm-hmm. Well, not necessarily. Well, least murder, but not least death necessarily. That's actually an interesting
least murder, but not
distinction.
least death.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
So there is still a moral universal here. The like true moral relativism would be like, I think we should pull the lever because people being alive is evil and
But AJ
or is
wants to
wrong.
maximize murder
Yes,
by pulling
exactly.
that lever.
Exactly. And because I'm a good person. I want to maximize murder because I'm good.
I do think this is. I think this is what's fun and interesting. Is not fun, whatever. Is that within absolutism you can still have disagreement. I think that the distinction with absolutism is that there are answers at the end of that debate or discussion, as opposed to relativism that ultimately ends with there's nothing to discuss, essentially.
Or and that's the point, is that we can have the discussion because there
Of
is an
agreement.
unquestioned premise there that we
Sure.
can rest on. Whereas in relativism, we're just passing the time.
Yes.
Because it's an expression of my morals and an expression of his morals, and really there's nothing to get to because there's nowhere to start.
Okay. So then let's see if we find Nietzsche compelling on this third one. So when someone is convicted of a crime, should they be punished?
Yes.
Graham, can you tell me why?
Justice.
Okay, just one word. Okay.
Yes.
And
That was essentially my answer.
was that
to
your
it.
answer to?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me give. This is Nietzsche's. This is a quote from a longer section, as all Nietzsche things are. So you'll get the point of it as I go through it. So Nietzsche goes on and on here. Foucault later makes a career out of this kind of questioning. To at least give an impression of how uncertain, belated, and haphazard the meaning of punishment is, and how one and the same procedure can be used, interpreted, and adapted for fundamentally different projects, you have here a formula that suggested itself to me on the basis of relatively restricted and random material. Punishment as a means of rendering harmless or preventing further harm. Punishment as payment of a debt to the creditor in any form, even one for emotional compensation. Punishment as a means of isolating a disturbance of balance to prevent further spread of the disturbance. Punishment as a means of inspiring the fear for those who those who determine and execute punishment, as a means of inspiring those who execute punishment. Punishment as a sort of counterbalance to the privileges which the criminal has enjoyed up till now. Punishment, isn't that a bad one? Yeah. If essentially they got rich, so now they have to get punished. Punishment as a rooting out of degenerate elements. And he goes on, but I will not. So the point he's making is that our reasons for punishing have changed over time. Any one of those reasons you can pull out and say, whoever's executing the punishment can say, I'm doing it for this reason. But what isn't changed is that someone who is able to do punishment is doing punishment to someone who is receiving punishment. And so that's what he'll point to and say is the absolute thing repeated through history, to take your example there. It's not that the reasons are the same, it's that you'll hate this, the power differential is the same, or I know you hate that, or that the relationship of the two is the same, and that's the constant over time. Tell me why that's wrong.
But I don't think the power dynamic is the same or the relationship is the same, because if your reasons differ, well, then your expression of the punishment is going to differ. So if you are punishing because you believe that this person is a moral agent and the punishment is actually going to be beneficial for their soul and their rehab, and they're standing before God one day, well, your punishment's going to be very different than if your reason behind it is you want to, give back, or you want to, get back what was given. So there's some sort of retribution. I want you to hurt as much as you hurt me.
Right.
So if you're somebody that says, I want you to hurt as much as you hurt me, your way of doing that punishment is going to have a different characteristic than if you are someone that says, you are a made in God's image soul. Well, you sort of, the last one you said was rooting out a degenerate element. And I think as modern people, we hear that and we're like, oh, who are you to tell me what is degenerate, and who are you to root out an element?
We have courts that do that all the
those
time.
things out. But, so the expression of punishment is going to differ based on the rationality behind it.
Sure.
So it's not just that. So it's even sort of silly to say that, like, that punishment is this category and it's always existed, and even though the differences, even though the reasons have changed, we still have this power dynamic. No, I don't think so. Like the rationale and the reasoning behind it drives like how it's actually going to take shape, right? Like you punish your kids, because you have a good for them that you want them to adhere to. And the punishment is effective.
Right.
Kids aren't rational creatures where you sit them down and explain to them why sticking their head in a chair and getting it caught. I don't think so.
He's not, no.
No one is. So it's the punishment actually works. Anyway.
I think it's ridiculous because there is a value here that has not changed, and that almost all the ones you mentioned are expressions of social justice. Right? If I have been getting rich in illegitimate ways, I should have to pay that back.
Yeah.
Or if I have to repay a debt, right? Both of those are expressions of justice. And so underlying all of this is the conviction that justice is good. And not only that, but that a social justice, a community is a good thing, right? Root out the evil element, repay debts, right? So underneath all of this, we are believing that men together is a good thing.
Yes.
And justice is a good thing, except for the one that's the dumbest I can think of.
Which one?
That's that we are giving out punishment to inspire the people doing the punishing.
Right.
Gosh, that's the most circular definition I can ever think of. It's like, I'm having them build 1,000 tables simply to inspire those who make tables. Like it's the worst reason.
Sure.
And you could justify anything that way.
Yes. But I think that's his point, is that the point he's trying to draw out is that you can justify anything with any reason you want to.
But he's wrong. That's the reason that sticks out, because all the others are aimed at justice.
So he's not too far off from what you're saying, except what he's trying to develop, where does conscience come from? And his conception of conscience comes from this desire for a community, and the debts we owe to that community then rest on us as individuals, and that we must live up to those debts that are given to us. So he's framing it differently, and it's not Graham, to your examples, it's not a loving family, a loving close-knit community working closely together. He's very focused on like merchants that grow rich, and when people attack their wealth, they can punish people who come at them. So obviously he's framing it very differently, but the good of community and maintaining that community is what he's pointing to for survival
benefits. That's the thing,
benefits.
is that would be one of the universals
that you could point to.
Is that community is a good.
I do think the other part of it is that trying to tie together all violence as having some common purpose and it being power always, or I don't know the right way to say it, but pre-mass forms of communication, like you don't know why someone 3 villages away is punishing someone in their village. There's no reason to think there's a connection between any of them.
Well, I think he's making a causal mistake. He is mistaking the definition of violence, which is someone in power hurting someone with less power, with the cause of violence.
I didn't know if there was a phrase for this. It's almost incidental. It's yes, he is technically correct that to do punishment, you must be in a position to do the punishment, but that doesn't say why it's happening. That's just the precondition for the punishment.
It is one of the facets of punishment, is that someone in power is hurting somebody.
So not for Robin Hood.
He's punishing the rich.
He's not in power.
They don't have the power to stop him.
That's true.
Right? He can do what he wants to because he's sneaky. Because he's sneaky and he's great at bows.
Sure.
And he's got a band of merry men.
They were very merry.
So merry?
I have not. I clearly need to read more in my life. Okay, so that's his second essay. Is where does conscience come from? It comes from this sense of debt that we have to our community. Again, there's some similarity between AJ what you're saying as this kind of good, but he doesn't paint it as good. He paints it as a necessity of survival in community is this debt that
So
we
he's
have.
assuming that survival is good?
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, we'll get there in just a second. Then the third essay I super won't go into. It's about asceticism, so like the denial of earthly goods. This entire section is him saying that we should ignore all forms of asceticism in artists because what made them great usually is something grand in them, something not ascetic. What's the opposite of ascetic? Flagrant is the word coming to mind. Living.
It wouldn't be libertine. It would be. Would it be? What's the word for someone who?
It's not the liberty. It's like the bigness of their lives. Like think of an artist like that.
The majesty?
Yes,
Oh, that's a great word.
Or the ornament,
Yeah.
like the ornamentation, like the
Both good words.
yeah.
And so he thinks that asceticism and majesty are opposites?
He says, so stick with me. He's making this argument that we should ignore when artists say asceticism is good, because often what makes the art good is the flamboyance.
When was the last time you heard an artist say, like, I live small?
So he's writing this, and he talks about this quite a bit.
Cardi said it, I think, recently. Cardi B?
Is that true? You made that up.
No, she definitely did not.
So we talked last time about how he had this on-again, off-again friendship with, it was actually on-again and then literally off for the rest of his life, friendship with Wagner, Richard Wagner. And that later in Wagner's life, he wrote an opera called Parsifal. And the essay is not only about this, but it seems to be essentially him attacking Wagner for coming around to a more conservative set of values in his elderly years. Mm-hmm. And Nietzsche is seeing this as an archetype of all artists, that they start off as young and bold and wanting to impart their vision to the world, and then they die normal.
Old conservatives.
Yes, exactly. That's not far off from what he's arguing. The only class of people who are exempt from this suspicion, do you want to guess who it is?
Philosophers?
It has to be philosophers.
Hey,
so
got it.
They're so mind-blowingly insightful that if they were to just speak their truth without the cover of asceticism, there would be riots in the street and people would be flocking to them and kings would seek to assassinate all philosophers.
Of course.
It's very silly. Anyway,
Delusions of grandeur,
Yeah.
maybe?
I keep inching into negativity toward this, but I think, just so I say it, to be clear, I think the earlier parts of the genealogy are much more compelling than the later parts. I think when Nietzsche is sticking to his field of study, language, philology, he has much more to say than at this point where he's in diatribe screed territory. So that's just my personal perception. Okay, so he'll trace some more things about asceticism, not super important. He'll end by saying this thing he's done in talking about tracing a genealogy of good and bad, that should be done for all values that we hold. That we should look at everything in our lives and say, why does this exist? Why is this something I believe? And to what degree is it merely something I have inherited? So this is again, we've referenced the phrase will to power, but I as an individual need to assess all the things around me and determine, do I want to keep it or do I want to throw it off and replace it with something else? And Nietzsche is not necessarily negative on this. He thinks this struggle is just core to what it is to be alive. And so as opposed to a Leopardi, who will say, give up, nothing matters, Nietzsche says, once more into the fray. Let's get into the fight. The struggle is part of the meaning. So I've done that. I've laid out this argument.
Am I allowed to agree with Nietzsche on that?
Sure.
That I think it is a healthful thing to look at the values you hold.
Yes.
Cut out the toxic people, AJ. Just cut them out.
Well, I mean, cut out the things that are perhaps inherited from family or church, all these things that are negative. For example, when I was young, I went to a pretty legalistic church, and it bred some pretty negative things in me. And if I wouldn't have evaluated those values, I could still be a pretty legalistic, terrible person. And I think that's a good thing. I think the only difference between what I'm doing and what Nietzsche is doing is he's saying do it in the absence of some sort of root values, although he still has one.
How do you know
it's the personal freedom is good.
But how do you know you wouldn't be the fine, upstanding person that you are now if you had not had your formative years in a legalistic church?
And I'm not saying that. I'm not like, that's fine. Formative years in legalism is great. I also had some really rough years growing up in school that have definitely formed me as a person. but it would be bad to have kept those attitudes.
right.
I'm just saying that when you say, okay, I'm at this point now where I'm going to like think of everything that I believe and uphold and act on, and I'm going to like whittle it down to first principles and ask myself whether I'm going to keep it or chuck it, whether it sparks joy or not.
Thank you.
It's like Marie Kondo, Nietzsche
yeah.
philosopher. How can you be assured that your perception of its value in your life is a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like
You can't.
You can't. So that if you do that all the time,
But not value my life, just the truth of the principle. And as I was going to say, I do it in light of like first principle real values and the gospel, right? That is where I'm kind of basing it. Like, is my legalism gospel centric? Really, no. Like it's not a gospel thing that I should be doing. And so that's something that I can chuck and should be chucked, right? And so I'm doing it within the realm of universals and openly acknowledging that those are things that I don't necessarily question, right? Murder is bad. I'm not going to question that. Pedophilia, also bad.
Right.
But other things that I believe and uphold, I can run through that gamut and say yes
but
or
you're
no.
you're running through that gambit and holding it up against a tradition, holding it up against a text, a story, a 2,000 year
reference
point
outside
of
of
reference
yourself.
outside of yourself, that, and you say like, okay, like, is my legalism upholding the gospel? And if you say no, okay, well then my legalism goes away. Whereas I don't think Nietzsche's saying that. He's saying the point of reference is
Yourself.
My own personal freedom.
my own personal freedom and my own taste, either at that moment, which opens up a whole problem of like your own headspace at the moment,
Right.
or so I'm not or my
saying-
own personal taste at this time.
Oh yeah, so I'm not saying you should do it how Nietzsche does it. I'm saying like it is a good thing to evaluate the things that maybe you unthinkingly believe,
Yes. Sure.
right?
I
And
think
that's why I love reading Nietzsche is because he forces you to do it.
Yep.
But I don't think you should do it and say I will only keep it if it sparks joy, right? If the morals in me give me more personal power and freedom.
I think doing that kind of inventory, that sort of like soul inventory, frequently is very profitable.
Yeah.
But if you don't have the point of reference, if your point of reference is like, does this make me more powerful? Then like you're going to be a jerk. Seriously, and or you are going to. There's problems with like optimizing for the short term that don't optimize in the long term.
Yeah.
Right. And so you may look at all of these things and you're like, well, this doesn't profit me. And you then therefore you optimize for the short term and then you've screwed up the long term.
Right.
Yeah.
And you just don't know that things are optimized for the long term because you're your own individual agent. Whereas a tradition of something has maybe optimized for the long term and has said, hey, you should hold to these values because, over a lifetime, believe it, following this is better for you than throwing off all traditions and optimizing for the short term because, well, you might die of syphilis one day or
Yeah,
whatever.
it's probably good to do this process with someone who has a little bit more, like, has seen a little more runway than you have.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right? So when I was young, I would have thrown off a lot of traditions because I'm like, they're silly. I don't need to do this.
Right.
Like, I don't need to force myself to pray. Prayer should be spontaneous.
Yes.
And what should have happened is I should have talked to somebody with some years under their belt and they went, well, you're not always going to want to pray, buddy. And you're not always going to be in a position to pray genuinely and honestly. And so the tradition is there to force you to do something you know is good for you, but don't necessarily want to. Yeah. So maybe do it with a mentor, but it is still a good process. I think we're on the same page on this one.
It's like that, the old, I was doing the very thing I hated. I think it says in the Bible somewhere. No, but it's the idea of like, don't remove the boundary stone until you know why the boundary stone was put there in the first place.
Yeah. So if you are doing this process with no reference at all,
Yes.
you are likely to burn down the house you're standing in.
Yes.
Right. You're like, I don't need these windows. I can do just as good without any windows and let the breeze in. And I don't need this door. And what are the walls for? I can't see the stars. And you're just going to burn your whole house
It's
down.
the problem of dialectic, right? Like,
Yeah.
Sure.
or where the novice gardener goes to the experienced gardener, and the experienced gardener says, "Well, the best way to grow more fruit is to prune my trees," and the novice gardener like cuts his entire garden down to the nubs.
Sure. That's
Right?
That's a good comparison.
And then he's left wondering why he has a wasteland.
Right.
And
Well, that's what.
There's so much room for stuff to grow.
Yeah. Because I don't know the way to say it. Because when Nietzsche's writing, kind of early on in this decline of Christianity as a social force, and I just think maybe this is to AJ's point. He just identifies so much that is going to happen. This sense of the death of God, this despair, like this.
But he's identifying it at a period of history when Christianity had sort of like, so let's separate like Christianity gospel and Christianity as like a social expression that had calcified into a way of life.
Yes.
That was dying.
Right,
that was
sure.
probably rotten from the beginning, and now it's just starting to show itself.
Yeah.
And he was right. And so Europe is not a, it has a Christian history, but it doesn't have, it's gone.
Not predominantly Christian now.
And so like the thing that he's often railing against is probably like worth railing against.
Sure.
Just like how Kierkegaard, when he was railing against the sort of calcified, like the Christian culture that was severed from the trunk, right? Like when he's railing against that, like he should be railing against that. It's in fact, T.S. Eliot has a great poem about this, but I won't get into it.
It's overrated. I wouldn't worry about it. So yes, that again, just to say again, I think there are helpful things to glean from going through Nietzsche. Again, this is probably the same thing we say after every book. In this, I don't think it's not a Christian point. It's just to observe that whenever you read something, keep the good and get rid of the bad. So there's something helpful and interesting here. It's not all perfect or good, and it gets used in weird ways during World War II. I already talked about that. So there's stuff to be careful with. Just to, since we're basically at time, the thing that I think is separating Nietzsche and Leopardi is this unstated assumption of the goodness of existence versus not existence. And I'm not sure that an argument can be made to justify one opinion or the other. But I think that for anyone who identifies as nihilist or wants to throw off all of their values, I think Leopardi's worldview actually needs to be contended with much more than maybe he is. Again, Nietzsche is much more popular than Leopardi, I think, because Nietzsche just is more optimistic in his own way, that there is kind of a hope in the meaninglessness as opposed to Leopardi.
Or you can appeal to your own selfishness.
You can do whatever you want to, right? Like, who wouldn't love that?
People love being told that they're right.
Freedom and power are good.
Yeah.
Well, it sounds awesome.
And so that's where I just think that for one wanting to slough off all values or whatever that come before, I think Leopardi's challenge needs to be studied, dealt with, thought about more carefully, because I'm not convinced that one is more rational than the other. And I think that's often the portrayal of why a nihilism is better. It's just the way things are. And
Cold rationalism.
Yeah, and I don't think that's true. This kind of debate or question goes back a long time. AJ, do you remember when Achilles is found in the underworld, when Odysseus finds him? Mm-hmm. Do you remember the conversation that they have?
Odysseus is like, man, you must be killing it down here. Got all the babes. You're ruling this place. You're so glorious. And Achilles is like, it sucks. Have you seen my kid? And I would rather be a dirt poor tenant farmer than rule over all these breathless dead.
Yeah.
Life is awesome.
Odysseus starts with this like praise of him, just like you said. Achilles responds, no winning words about death to me, shining Odysseus. By God, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt poor tenant farmer, that's what you just said, who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead. And so I think that there is the tension that Leopardi and Nietzsche show is an old tension. Again, Odysseus has a praise of Achilles' glory, even though he's dead. And Achilles would rather have life than not life. So anyway, it's a long-standing tension, but one that I think we like the answer of Nietzsche, but saying why it's better on purely rational grounds I think is really hard to do. So that's the only place to end with that. We're at an hour right now.
Cool.
Thank you all for your time.
Awesome. Well, this has been Classical Stuff You Should Know with Graham, Thomas, and AJ. If you want to @ us, you can @ us on the twits at Classical Stuff, CLSSCAL stuff. You can email us at theguys@classicalstuff.net. You can find us you found us, so you know how to find us. But we've got a website. We got a Patreon where you can find in-between episodes and you can talk to us in comment sections, and it's fun. And we will catch you next week.
Bye.
Bye.